Good Roads podcast, where we explore the ideas, people, and policies shaping transportation infrastructure across Ontario. Today, we're joined by someone whose work has influenced how leaders around the world think about planning, risk, and decision making. Dan Gardner is a Canadian author, journalist, and expert in forecasting and human behavior. He's a co-author, alongside megaproject scholar Bent Flyvbjerg, of the bestselling book How Big Things Get Done, which examines why so many projects, from home renovations to major infrastructure builds, run into trouble, and what we can do to get better results. The lessons from Dan's work are incredibly relevant for Ontario's municipalities. Whether you're managing road construction, rolling out safety improvements, or planning community projects, the principles he lays out, planning slow, acting fast, managing risk, and understanding how human behavior shapes outcomes, offer practical guidance for leaders at every level. Dan will also be the keynote speaker at the 2026 Good Roads Conference in March of this year. Dan, we're thrilled to have you on the podcast. Thank you for joining us.
Nice to be here.
Wonderful. So for listeners who may not know you, tell us a bit about yourself. You have a background in journalism, yet you co-authored a book about megaprojects. How did that happen?
Yeah, it's a little odd, but it actually goes straight to the core of the book. My background in my previous books, 3 previous books, and in a lot of my journalism, was basically human decision making. How do people decide what to worry about, what not to worry about? How do they decide to tackle big projects or whatever? And I became a self-taught expert in psychology, put it that way. And then I co-authored a book about forecasting called Super Forecasting. My co-author on How Big Things Get Done, Bent Flyvbjerg. By the way, I want to express my congratulations on your valiant attempt to pronounce his last name. That was not nearly as awful as most such attempts are. He's Danish, what can you say? But my co-author read Super Forecasting, and the gist of Bent's work, and of course, if you're in the world of mega projects, you almost certainly have either come across or Bent by name. You have certainly come across his research. He's an enormously credentialed and influential scholar in the field. And here's the really interesting point. Bent's take on mega projects is that the fundamental reasons why the track record is as bad as it is, and we can get into that, is not about engineering. It's not about science. It's not about technology. The fundamental reason is human decision making. And you can see that, in fact, in sort of how we open the book. Bent has this, for 30 years, he's been developing this database of mega projects. And there are an enormous range of categories in this database. Every transportation type, every energy type, defense, IT, including all sorts of categories where you go, these categories of projects, they don't have anything to do with each other, right? What does an IT project have to do with tunnels, right? It has nothing to do with tunnels. And yet what Bent has shown in his research and in his database is that, in fact, there are common patterns. Why are there common patterns? Because of what is common to all these categories, which is people, right? It's really the people that matter. It's really the mistakes that people make that are cause the projects to go wrong. And so that's why Bent sought me out as a co-author, because that's sort of my specialty, is people and how they think.
Huh. All right. Well, it's interesting. We're talking about like these big projects. We got lots going on in Ontario, in the pipeline. When we're talking to government, it's like there's this idea in the book that you got to think slow and act fast. But of course, a lot of these government decision making, it's like think fast. We'll work out the details later. This is kind of the big problem with politics when it gets involved. Good Roads is obviously a municipal organization. We're sort of beholden to the big projects that get announced at the province. How can governments of all sizes, how do they strike this balance between this political will to act fast and execute, somewhere down the line, and how do you get that? How do you slow them down? How do you slow down that thinking? How do you strike the
Well,
balance?
the first step is recognizing the problem, right? If you're going to deal with the problem, you have to understand the problem first. So then the question is, and as we emphasize in the book, the problem is very clear when you look at the pattern with failed projects across all these different categories. And again, I want to emphasize all the different categories. You see the same pattern, and the pattern is what we call think fast, act slow.
Mm-hmm.
By think fast, we mean you engage in quick and superficial planning.
Mm-hmm.
You do planning that isn't rigorous, isn't serious, does not surface problems. And of course, what happens then, you say, well, let's just get to work. Let's get shovels in the ground. And everyone's very excited because, of course, you very quickly have a large hole, and a large hole means progress, and progress is good. So the project is
bunch of guys with hard hats standing around going, what's next?
Outstanding. Love to see it because it's, you can see it's visible, right? It's tangible.
Yeah.
But the problem, of course, is that you didn't engage in the rigorous planning that would have surfaced the problems that you could have surfaced. You did not find the solutions for those problems, and you did not do all this work in planning when costs are very low. Those problems, they don't go away. They will surface eventually, except now they're going to surface during delivery. And when they surface during delivery, things get very expensive very quickly. You start to run around. You're trying to solve the problems. You're trying to find the solutions to the problems during delivery, which is much more difficult than during planning. And of course, these problems don't just surface singly, right? This will happen. This problem will pop up. Another problem will pop up. And then they'll start to impact each other. Like cars on a foggy highway, you start to get this slow buildup of problems. And what happens is the project, which starts as a gallop, and everyone's very excited, slowly slows down, and then it becomes a long, slow, painful death march. And that's when your budget goes up in flames, your schedule goes up in flames, everything goes wrong, and you're just trying to get to the finish line, right? You just want to get this done. You see that pattern over and over and over again. So then we have to ask, all right, well, why does that happen? And the answer to think fast, act slow is when you dig into the causes, right? We should know that you should engage in rigorous planning before you ever put a shovel in the ground, right? Everybody knows this. Like my grandfather taught me the old expression, measure twice, cut once, right? There's folk wisdom like that in every language around the world. I know this because whenever I go to foreign countries where they speak some other language, I will ask them, do you have folk wisdom like measure twice, cut once? And in every case, they always do. So everybody, I think, since the dawn of time, I will be so bold as to make this claim that every culture since the dawn of time has known that you should plan carefully before you act. But we don't do that. And by the way, of course, why do you plan carefully? And I should emphasize this point. Why do you plan carefully? Because that's going to give you a smooth delivery, fewer problems, and smooth is fast. There's a wonderful saying in the U.S. military, slow is smooth, smooth is fast. It's a deep paradox, but there it is. Slow down in order to speed up, okay? So then the question is, if we all know this, if this is folk wisdom, why don't we do it? Right? Like there's so much money in these projects, and these projects are so important, right? They're how we develop cities and regions and countries. So why don't we do it? Why do we keep falling into this mistake? Why do we keep doing the opposite of what we should be doing? And our argument comes down to basically three elements: politics, culture, and psychology. Politics. Break down why politics, and of course here I don't mean partisan politics or anything like that. I mean politics in the broad sense of who gets what, right? Every big project, there's lots of money involved, there's power, there's status, there's all sorts of good stuff, and everybody wants a taste, okay? And so there's politics involved. Here's the thing about politics. When you examine how politics intersects with planning of big projects, what you will find is that over and over and over again, quick and superficial planning is really useful. Like the simplest way, the most common way that this happens is if I'm a contractor and I want to land that contract on that big project, I want to get some of that money. Well, what's the best way to do it? Particularly if you're dealing with a public client, they're going to do a low-cost bid. Whoever bids lowest wins the contract. Right. Well, what's the solution? I got to bid low. How do I bid low? Well, if I overlook certain obvious problems, in other words, I don't engage in serious planning, I turn a blind eye to those problems, I can have a nice low number. Then I'll win the contract, and somewhere down the road, I'll call my lawyer and we'll hash it out in court, right? Because, of course, that problem's still going to surface, and we're going to work it out, but we're going to work it out later. I need to get the contract now. So, I mean, there's countless ways. There are many, many variations on that theme. That's the classic, but there are many, many variations on that theme.
So how do we prevent that from happening, Dan?
Oh, well, the first answer is, I mean, that's the whole book, basically. I mean, but actually, let me just finish the thought, and I'll come back to politics. Okay, so I said politics, culture, psychology, and very briefly, the other one element is culture. In business culture, particularly private sector, there's very often a culture of can do. Right? I'm an executive. I do stuff. I'm not a planner. Planning is bureaucratic, paperwork and talking and so on. I'm getting stuff done. I'm the guy who gets shovels in the ground, right? And very often that's a positive culture. A can-do culture is a positive thing. But if it's allowed to become understrained, it can lead to a very dumb conclusion, which is, we've got enough planning done. Let's get on with it, right? And then third point is psychology. And this is really fundamental, the part that people routinely miss. If you look at all the elements of human psychology that we know from psychological science that intersect with big projects, there are many of them. And if you line them all up and look, I can tell, because I've done this, they all lean in the same direction. They all lean in favor of overconfidence. They all lean in favor of, we've got this figured out, we know enough, let's get on with it. So what you've got is a situation where politics, culture, and psychology are all lined up and pushing in the same direction, the wrong direction. Okay? So now you've recognized that this is the fundamental problem. This is what's causing people to go think fast and therefore act slow. How do we push back against it? In large part, it has to do, let's go to the politics, for example. Here's an illustration. I'm going to use a very famous and very bad project as an illustration. California high-speed rail. Arguably, I mean, it's not done yet. It's not officially over, but arguably, this is one of the worst projects in modern history, right?
Yeah.
Staggering amounts of money have been spent, and they have not moved a single passenger, and it looks an awful lot like they never will build a high-speed rail line between Los Angeles and San Francisco. Why did this happen? Well, here's one element that's really important. How much high-speed rail is there in all of the United States of America? Zero. There isn't any. So how much experience do American engineers and American engineering firms have with high-speed rail? Zero. Pretty obvious. So when California comes along and says, we're going to build high-speed rail, great idea, the French firm SNCF pops up and says, hey, you know what? We've been designing, building, and operating high-speed rail for 60 years. They open an office in San Francisco and they say, hey, hire us. in some capacity, and we'll work with you, and we'll give you the benefit of our 60 years of experience. California was unable to come to terms with SNCF. And so SNCF said, see ya.
Mhm.
And you ended up with a whole bunch of Americans who had never built high-speed rail, trying to build high-speed rail in an incredibly politically fraught environment.
Yeah.
And you have a
Wow.
mess as a result. Now, here's the part that isn't in the book. And I really desperately wish it were in the book, but I only learned it after the book was published. Around the same time that California said it was going to build high-speed rail, the Morocco said the same thing. We're going to build high-speed rail. How much high-speed rail is there in all of Africa? 0. So how much experience does Morocco have building high-speed rail? 0.
Right.
Morocco goes to SNCF and they come to terms and they basically form a partnership. So you have a Moroccan company that's in charge. The Moroccans are in charge, and you want to do industrial development. You've got Moroccan engineers. You've got all this good stuff going on, but you're fully partnered with SNCF. And as a result, they end up forming a training academy, and they form joint teams at all levels for all key points. And guess what? I think it takes something like 7 years. And guess what? Morocco's high-speed rail opens in 2018, and it has been operating successfully ever since. Perfect opposite, right? Why? What's the difference? The difference is experience. You have to maximize experience. Why didn't California maximize it? The smart thing to do would have been SNCF. You know what you're doing? You're hired. Off you go, right? Why didn't they do that? It's politics. There's a political problem, right? You can't go and hire a French company and say to the French company, bring in a whole bunch of French engineers and right? This is a proud American project here in the great state of California. You have
made in America solution.
Made in America. And this is a classic political problem that particularly public sector faces all the time.
Right.
So how do you solve? And this is to answer your question. If that's the political impetus that's pushing you in the wrong direction, how do you solve that? Well, you have to have a political solution. Morocco found the political solution, which is to say it created a Moroccan company that was in charge with Moroccan engineers and Moroccan managers and all that good stuff. But they had a full comprehensive partnership so that they were able to benefit from all that good French experience.
Yeah.
So you solve the political problem, but you're also doing the smart engineering thing, which is maximizing experience. And that's what you end up having to do in all of these cases. Once you've recognized that politics is the problem, you got to find political solutions for the political problems. Once you recognize that culture is the problem, you have to find cultural solutions to the cultural problems. And psychology, same thing. You have to, and of course, all of this starts with awareness, right? Recognize, well, what is the source of the problem? What's compelling us to go and do the wrong thing? Yeah. Find the relevant solution and push back in the opposite direction.
Have you sent your book to the guys working on the Alto project, the high-speed rail project? It's one of those.
I don't know. I don't know a lot about it, but I recently was at an event where somebody said, they're working on Alto, and by the way, SNCF is involved. So
I was going to say, I heard that when you're talking, like, oh, thank God that's what's happening.
Because it's incredibly easy to do. Now, by the way, of course, on all these stories, I'm always simplifying because in any big project, like the California situation, why didn't they come to terms? Partly it was political, it was other reasons. It's a mess. Yeah. They're always messy. But the fundamental principle is always the same. Recognize the source of the problem that's pushing you in the wrong direction, find a solution to that, and then you're pushing back in the opposite direction, right?
Yeah.
So you have to be saying, and this is the phrase that we use in the book, we repeat it like a mantra, think slow, act fast. You want to engage in rigorous, serious planning that finds problems, planning that finds solutions to those problems to the extent that they can, because big projects are always going to have surprises, nasty surprises. But to the extent that you can find those problems in advance, you find them in advance, you solve them in advance, and only then does delivery begin. And because you engage in that serious planning, you have a good, reliable, tested plan. Your delivery is smooth, and smooth is fast, and Bob's your uncle. You win.
Yeah. Well, I think Alto might be a good example of that because like their timelines are very long. It seems like they are doing the planning, the slow planning over time. So it seems like they're going in the right direction. So then we can talk about execution, and I hope that's where they don't go wrong, because I know that rail projects are isolated or identified in your book as a big offender for cost overruns and taking way too long. So hopefully they can execute speedily. And this kind of like goes back to what you were saying about politics and power and that relationship. And the book talks about ambition and drive and using that as a driving force, because it's kind of funny because that's also the driving force behind a lot of these snap political division. It's ambition and drive, and then they leave it to the bureaucrats. So when we're actually executing, and I kind of want to frame this in the municipal perspective because it's like smaller order of government, less power under their belts. When they're executing on these projects, how do they use this ambition and the drive to actually drive them forward? What sort of powers do they have under their belt to actually push this forward? How do they use this?
Well, first is to recognize that ambition and drive are essential, absolutely, but potentially dangerous. It is very common for people in big projects for various reasons, including politics, to fixate on, by God, we're going to do this, and think that basically that, ambition and drive is enough. So we give an example of an opera house that was built in Copenhagen. And it was an example where basically the executive, who was also bankrolling the project, was a famously demanding person who basically said, here's what's going to happen and here's how you're going to do it. And then he basically pushed and demanded and demanded and demanded. To a certain extent, that sort of behavior is, of course, necessary in a big project. But if you push it unreasonably, you basically can break the project. A perfect example of this is, in fact, this is a very personal example for me, the Ottawa LRT. Ottawa, and I say it's personal because I shivered on the stand, on the platform, waiting for that train to arrive when it was broken down in the middle of the Ottawa winter. Ottawa LRT. There are many reasons why, of course, it failed, why it was such a bad project. But one of the key ones was that the mayor fixated on an early figure for political reasons. He fixated on a 2.1 figure, $2.1 billion. And he said, we're going to do this and it's going to cost $2.1 billion. But the problem was that was basically a preliminary estimate. That wasn't an estimate based on, we've done rigorous, serious planning, and here's what we estimate the cost to be. No, it was a very preliminary figure. But he got fixated on that figure, and he kept repeating that figure, and it became very political. And you could see he was staking his reputation. He was staking his political future on that figure. And what happens is that's an arbitrary number. You're now fixated on an arbitrary number. You can beat the drums and you can say, damn it, you're going to do this. And all you're going to end up doing is breaking the project because the number is not real, right? And so what they ended up doing in order to meet that very arbitrary number is they started to cut corners. A simple example. LRT, you got to have double doors because the one door, when it closes, stops passengers who are angry and standing on the platform from interfering with the inner door, the important door on the train, right? In Ottawa LRT, there's only one set of doors. Why is there only one set of doors? That was their way of saving a few bucks to try and meet the $2.1 billion, right? That's the kind of thing that happens when you fixate on, something that's arbitrary and then just demand. That's not a smart way of going about it. Again, it goes back to you've got to do the rigorous, serious planning. Once you know that the dollar figure or the schedule, that these things are really tested and reliable, these are very meaningful estimates, then you can start to get a little more demanding. You can beat the drums, you can push harder. But if you haven't done that and you start beating the drums, and you're just going to cause a mess.
Mm-hmm.
Fair enough.
Sorry. I haven't actually. That was a caveat. I realize now I haven't actually answered your question. So, that question now: you're going to delivery. How do you use ambition and drive in order to have a successful delivery? Again, this is predicated on the first point. Let's assume that you have that big, serious, rigorous, tested, reliable plan. Okay.
Yeah. This is a fantasy scenario. We're getting to that point. We're ready to move.
The point is, you got to do these things in order, right? If you don't have that serious, reliable plan, you can do delivery. You can have outstanding people doing all the right things in delivery, and if you got a lousy plan, it's still going to blow up in your face, right? You can't ask people to do the impossible. But let's say you've got that serious plan and now you're into delivery. How do you use ambition and drive in order to accomplish this? Well, in the book, we tell the story of Terminal 5 at Heathrow Airport in London, England. Of course, one of the world's busiest airports. And we do that for a very specific reason. Number one, airport terminals, lousy track record, but Terminal 5 was a very successful project. And under really, really difficult circumstances, they basically had to build this enormous, unbelievably complex airport terminal in the middle of Heathrow while Heathrow was operating. They could not actually shut down Heathrow's operations for even a minute. And just because that wasn't enough pressure, they also added a deadline. They actually said 6 years in advance. They said this project will be completed and it will open for operation 6 years from now. And I believe it was like March 26th at 4 a.m. They were that precise, right? So tons of pressure. Now, if you imagine what a project of that scale is, like that's a staggering number of contractors and subcontractors and lawyers and corporations and tradespeople, and it's just a staggering complexity, right? But here's what they did that was absolutely brilliant and brilliantly executed and better than most projects. From the very beginning, the manager of construction, an engineer named Andrew Wolstenholme, who's a former a member of the Royal Engineers in Britain's Army, which is a relevant point. From the very beginning, he said what we need to do is create a cohesive team that has the ambition and energy, right? Well, how on earth do you create a cohesive team out of tens of thousands of people from these completely different backgrounds, doing completely different jobs and so on? And they had a deliberate strategy, which, by the way, plug my talk, I will go through in some detail. But they had a deliberate strategy. And from the very beginning, the very first step of that strategy is, what's the goal? And this is a point which I will be emphasizing in my talk enormously. Every big project must start with a thorough discussion of what is the purpose of the project. What are we trying to achieve? You'd be amazed how often that does not happen. Very
seems obvious.
Right? It seems the most obvious thing in the world, and yet it routinely does not happen. In fact, the way I illustrate it is this, how do big projects start? Well, somebody says, let's build a bridge to the island. And somebody else says, great, what a fantastic idea. And somebody else says, no, that'd be too expensive. And somebody else says, well, a bridge would be great, but not to that island, to the other island, and so on. And now you've got a debate going, and you're all debating. See what's happening? There's an implicit communication. Let's build a bridge to the island. Why? You haven't said why. The person who responded didn't say why. The other person who responded didn't say why. You're all operating on the basis of implicit communications. You need to make that discussion explicit, absolutely explicit, and so that you can really dig into it and say, well, what are we really trying to achieve here? If you do that, you then develop, by the end of this conversation, a very clear, sharp image of exactly what the goal is, the purpose of the project, which is the whole point, right? Why is that so important? There's a whole bunch of reasons why it's important, but one of the reasons has to do with delivery. Two things. If I'm telling all these thousands of people working on the project, right, come on, gang, let's get together and be a team. This is really important. Gosh darn it. Am I convincing you? No, that's just, I've given you a pep talk. That's just noise, right? If you're a welder on the project and every day you go to the project and what do? You weld two pieces of pipe together. And the next day you weld some pieces of pipe together. And I go to you as an outside observer and I say to you, what are you doing here? And you shrug and say, I'm welding pieces of pipe together. Is that person passionate about this project? Do they really believe in this project? Are they bringing everything they are to the project, right? Not just their hands, but also their brains and their heart, their ideas. No, of course not. It's just a job, right? Mm-hmm. But if you say, for example, you're building a pipeline which will secure national energy security. And I show up at that project and I say to the same welder, I say, what are you doing here? And the welder says, I am contributing to my nation's national energy security. It's a bit of a difference, isn't it? Right? Yeah. In fact, if you had gone, this is a very famous example, 1960s, you go to NASA headquarters and you go and find the guy who's pushing the broom, the janitor, and you say, what are you doing here? That person would have said, I'm putting a man on the moon. Everybody at NASA would have said, I'm putting a man on the moon, because that was the goal.
Yeah.
We're all doing this together. And so you can do that if from the very beginning of the project, you have clarity as to what the purpose of the project is. They did that with Terminal 5. We're building Britain's gateway to the world. And they had this whole corporate, I won't call it a propaganda exercise, but it was a propaganda exercise. They had, posters that said, we're making history too. And the poster would show like a partially completed Eiffel Tower, so that you were invited to think, you know what, I'm making something as important as the Eiffel Tower, right? I'm making history too. Now, big projects routinely have, PR campaigns like that. They all do that. Yeah. You know how often that matters? Pretty much never. It's pretty much always.
Yeah.
Not in this case. Why? Because number one, there was clarity about the purpose. But number two, and this is the other really critical part, which people routinely ignore, particularly corporate executives. People who work in construction sites don't ignore this, but corporate executives, they ignore this. At Terminal 5, they made a very deliberate effort to communicate to employees, everybody, every worker, that your contribution matters. How did they do that? Again, not just with words. They went to them and they said, for example, we want to post examples of Class A work for your trade, for what you're doing. What does really good work look like? And so the workers were asked to define that themselves. And they posted this as images saying, here it is. This is the standard that we're aiming for. And the standard was set by the workers themselves. The other thing that they did was they went to them and said, what about processes? Are there processes that we're engaged in on this construction site that could be improved? Do you have ideas for making things better? And they really listened to them. This was not lip service. They really listened to them. And the third thing that they did was they said to them, we're going to give you first-class physical plant for your operations. So your canteen, we're going to have great food. You go the showers, we're going to have excellent showers. We're going to have excellent change rooms, personal protective equipment. and apparently this was unheard of on British construction sites. You got wet gloves? Turn them in. We'll give you a fresh pair of new gloves. You got a scratch on your goggles? Turn them in. We'll give you new goggles. And you know what? That was expensive. They they spent a lot of money on that. But think about the sub-communication. What does that communicate to the workers? What that communicates to the workers is, you really do matter. This isn't lip service. We're demonstrating with real money that we think you matter. So that when they came along and Andrew Wolstenholme gave them the pep talk saying, gosh darn it, this is important, let's all pull together as a team, guess what? They actually believed it. They really believed this mattered. They pulled together as a team. I've got some wonderful quotes about, there was a construction foreman talking about how this is a guy who had been in construction from the age of 15 and he's now in his 60s. And he said he's been on projects all over the world. He's seen everything. And he's never seen a level of enthusiasm and support for the project like what he saw at Terminal 5. They successfully turned tens of thousands of people from all these disparate organizations into a cohesive team.
Well, that's a very interesting story. I wonder though, Dan. So your book and everything you've been kind of talking about so far, obviously, it's about how to get big things done, right? A lot of our listeners, and a lot of our members, and a lot of people will be coming to our conference in March. They come from smaller communities. Some of these towns are, 1,000 people, 5,000 people. They might not have big projects like London Heathrow or the Alto high-speed rail, but they have projects that they would consider to be very big, like a bridge kind of leading to their community or a really important roads project. Does all this stuff that you're talking about apply to some of these smaller communities where their projects, again, not big in and of themselves, maybe like dollar-wise, but important to the community?
Yep. Listen, I grew up in a town of 400 people. To me, the town of 1,000 people was the big smoke. So I'm very familiar with different scales of big. And the thing I really always emphasize is this. And we were determined from day one that the focus of the book was on those elements of projects, planning, and delivery that are scale invariant, to use the term academics would use. Scale doesn't matter. If it's big to you, it's relevant to you. So, for instance, we have a chapter on a home renovation, a kitchen renovation, in fact. Well, actually, it started as a kitchen renovation. It became a home renovation, which is part of the story. But the point is, if you look at an individual homeowner and you're about to engage in, a project of renovation that you think will cost like maybe $50,000, is that big? If you're managing it, darn right, it's big. And you know what? It can go wrong for the very same reasons that the multi-billion-dollar mega project can go wrong. But similarly, it can go right for the same reasons that the billion-dollar mega project can go right. So absolutely, this is scale invariant stuff. These are principles which apply up and down to every human undertaking. Again, remember the point I made at the start about how what matters is the human factor. That's what we're focused on. So The way we put it is, if your project involves humans, this is relevant to you.
Just pivoting to that, it's like, again, looking at this smaller scale, because like we're talking about sort of like I like this story from Heathrow because it's sort of like a cultural thing. It's like you're actually instituting a culture of the project. How do we do that at a smaller scale? Because like, municipalities, we got multiple departments, we got councils, we got consultants, we got stakeholders involved, we got the community involved. How do we turn this fragmented group into like, a unified, like project directed a group with a culture? How do you do that?
The exact same principles. In fact, of course, the smaller it is, the easier it is. Right? It's easier to get your arms around, 100 or 200 people than it is to get your arms around tens of thousands, isn't it? What's essentially required is clarity from the beginning. My goal is to create a cohesive team. What are the elements required to create that cohesive team? And then to throw yourselves energetically into that project of creating a cohesive team. So I mentioned Andrew Wolstenholme, the head of construction at Terminal 5. Andrew Wolstenholme estimated that he spent something like half of his work time, and he was putting in long hours, speaking with people. Going from one group to another group, to another group, to another group, internal and external. Even though he was the head of construction and he was constantly dealing with people doing the construction, he spent an enormous amount of time going external and speaking to stakeholders and saying, here's what we're up to, here's what we're facing, here's our status report, here's the latest update, and so on. You should think of yourself, and somebody in that position should think of him or herself as the coach of a team, right? And if you want, you can throw in hockey team because we're Canadians. Go with the mandatory analogy. You don't just assume that team spirit emerges by itself, right? It is a conscious and deliberate effort. And who's in charge of that effort? You are. So what are you doing about it? How do you develop that? And again, there are specific principles. In fact, during my talk, I'll actually be using a sports team as an analogy to break this down and make it simpler for folks. But the principles are, again, to use that term scale invariant, if you think about bringing 10 people together into a cohesive team, what would you do to bring 10 people into a cohesive team? Those principles, what you would do, are exactly what you would do for 100 people or 1,000 people, right? The mechanisms may have to change because you're dealing with more people, but the principles are the same.
Fair enough. Andrew, is there anything else you want to mention? Because I was gonna say, Dan, I think we're getting kind of close to the end of our hour here. So before we wrap up this talk, is there anything else you want to leave with our listeners? Going into the conference between now and then, any final thoughts that you want to impart on them?
It's interesting. Okay, early in the writing of the book, I was going through Bent's decades and decades of his own research. And I said to Bent, I figured it out. I can actually boil all your work, all your worldview down to a single word. And he was intrigued because he never thought of it in those terms, right? He was doing research on this, he was doing research on that. And it came down ultimately to one word. And then we developed that into a bunch of different principles and so on. But that word is experience. If we start there, if you start valuing experience, you can tease out these principles that we develop in the book, because that's exactly how we did it. We started with experience and we worked outward from there. So, I often encourage people, because very often there's gray hair and wrinkles in the audience. That's good. Congratulations. I like seeing gray hair and wrinkles. The experience is foundational. And if you're going to remember any one thing from the book, value experience.
Well, you'll certainly get a lot of the gray hairs and wrinkles at our conference in March. So
great.
Well, that brings us to the end of today's episode of the Good Roads podcast. Huge thank you to Dan Gardner for joining us and for sharing such thoughtful insights about how projects can succeed and why they so often don't. If you enjoyed this conversation, don't forget to register for the 2026 Good Roads Conference to see Dan live at the Fairmont Royal York Hotel in Toronto. Visit goodroads.ca to register. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube and social media channels. And thank you, everyone, for listening. We'll see you at the next one.